Hey and welcome back to another video, and in this video we're going to use our knowledge of JSON and generics from our previous video in this free SwiftUI course, SwiftUI iOS take-home test. We're actually going to look at how we can build a help construct that allows us to easily read static JSON within our project. So in our project we're going to add in some static JSON files so we can use them later for when we want to build out our screens without needing an API just yet. So let's create a new folder in our resources folder called JSON. So in resources, we're going to create a new group and it's called JSON, like so. And then within this is where we're going to store our JSON files that we'll use later on in the next couple of videos. So what is the purpose of putting the JSON files in here? Well, when you work with an app, you want to essentially model your app with some kind of like static data when you're just building the UI. You don't actually want to type out the entire networking code. You just want to have some dummy data that you can work with, and then you replace that dummy data with the real data. So in our case, we're going to actually create two JSON files because we have two API requests that where we get a list of users and we get a specific user. So in this file, let's create our first JSON file called users static data. So in here, we're going to choose new file, and then we're going to scroll down here, and then we're going to select an empty file. So you should see this under other, and then hit next. And then in here, we're going to create our users static data.json. Like so. And now what we want to do is actually run the request in Postman that we saved in our earlier video and actually copy the JSON response that we get back from it and paste it within here. So let's go into our Postman. And we've already got it open here actually, but just to show you that, if you just hit send, you'll see that this actually works and gets a list of our users. And then we just simply want to copy this. So I'm going to hit copy here. And then we just want to go back into our file and then just simply just paste it within here like so. Cool. So now we have our JSON file within this file. So we want to do the same thing, but this time for a single user. So let's create a new file called single user data.json. So same again, we'll scroll down to empty and then single user data.json. And then we want to go back into Postman and then go to single user and then hit send. And then now again, we just want to copy this and then just paste it and hit save. Cool. So now you may be wondering about the create endpoint. Well, this view is actually where we actually send a request to actually create a user. So that's Osmo sending data. We're not actually receiving data. So we don't actually need a static JSON file to handle that screen specifically. We only need these two files for the two screens where we're going to build the UI based off a response. So now that we actually have our JSON files in the folder, we need to actually create our actual models. Now looking at our JSON, we could essentially actually type this out using codable if we wanted to ourselves. But instead of us doing that, what I'm going to do is actually use a tool from one of my previous videos in SwiftUI sessions called Best iOS Development Tools, and it's called QuickType. And what QuickType allows us to do is easily create models so that we can just put in our JSON and then we just paste our models into our project. So let's open up QuickType. So when you land on the QuickType website, you should see an option here to open QuickType, which is what we want. And then what we need to do is actually copy our JSON. So we'll just do the single user data first. And then we'll simply just put this in here like so. Cool. So if you actually look at our JSON, you'll notice that the JSON that we have in this here is actually very similar to the JSON that we have in this file as well. So some of the files, well, some of the models that we actually have, we're actually going to reuse them. So in here, you'll notice after you paste in your JSON is that it actually spits out a struct and it tries to name it. Now, by default, the name is welcome. So I'm actually going to change this to user detail response. And you should see that it actually updates that within the, what it spits out here for the struct. Now, one thing that I do want to do is I actually don't want to have the coding keys. So one thing to note here is I actually don't want the coding keys. So when we actually copy this over, we'll actually take this out. And another thing to note as well is that some of the naming isn't the best. So let's actually just copy this and we'll create a new file within our project called user detail response. So we actually want this to be a model from within our detail models folder. So let's create that in here now. So now let's actually just paste that in. And then we're going to tweak this a bit. So like I said before, we don't actually need the coding keys anymore. So let's just take this out. So another thing to note here as well is that this is actually called data class, but it's worth noting that this actually isn't really a clear name because it's actually about the user. So instead of calling this data class, let's instead call this user. And then we're going to need to rename this to user as well. And then now we have support. So now let's just change this mark here to user. We'll also change this. We'll keep this as support. All right, cool. So this looks good to me. So like I said before, if you actually look at our user static data, so our array of users, the model for the user and the support is literally the exact same here. So these two are reused again when you actually get a list of users. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to actually create a new file in here called users response, like so. And then what we're just going to do this time is we're actually going to just copy the JSON for when you want to get an array of users. So let's just copy this. And we're going to paste that within QuickType. And we're going to change this to users response. So let's just change this. And we're just literally just going to copy this bit here. And then we're going to create a new, so in our users response file, we're just going to paste in it here, like so. And then our mark. And then this time we have an array of users. So rather than having this saying datum, we're going to actually change this to be user. So we're going to reuse our model from here. And then we're also going to reuse the support from here as well. And we're going to take out these coding keys. And the reason why is because these, like you can see here with this snake casing, we're actually going to automatically enable converting from snake casing to camel casing within our encoder in a bit. So let's just take this out. Cool. So now we have our model for our user's response, which is reusing the model from our detail here. Now you actually could argue here that because we're actually reusing this and support between multiple files, we actually could move this into a new folder because it's not specific. Neither one of these two are specific to just the detail and just the people. So actually, to make this cleaner, what we're going to do is actually create a new folder in our base called model. And then we're going to create a new Swift file called models. And then we're just going to basically put in this file any models that are shared between multiple features. So in this case, that's going to be our user and our support. So let's just take this out. And then let's put that inside of our models like so. Cool. So now we have that separated out and we can easily reuse this in more than one feature if this was to grow in the future. So this is looking good. Okay, cool. So now that's all organized and set up. So now we have everything that we need. So now the next thing we need to do is actually create a new folder in our base called mapper, and we'll create a new file called static JSON mapper. So let's do that now. So let's create a new folder, mapper, and then let's create a new file within here called static JSON mapper. Cool. So what is the purpose of this file? Well, it's to actually help us quickly prototype our app by using the local JSON files we just created, so we can create a function that handles this for us. So let's actually create a static JSON mapper struct and define a function that will help us decode one of the JSON files that we just added in a second ago. So we'll just type out the skeleton for now and then we'll break it down. So what I've done here is I've got a struct called static JSON mapper, and I've got a static function called decode where you pass in a file, and you don't need to initialize this object, you just literally just call decode and it will eventually return the mapped model back to us. So let's actually add in some code to actually help us fetch the JSON file that we have within the app bundle. So I'm actually going to add this in and then we'll break it down. So what's going on here is we're actually passing in the file name from our function, and we're essentially saying in the bundle, get me the path for that file, and then access the contents of that file and then give it to us back as data so we can handle it. Now, if it can't find the path or the data, what's going to happen is the function is going to return and stop execution. So that's the whole point of this guard here. So now that we actually have our data, what we want to do is actually decode it. So let's actually use our JSON decoder to do this now. So we've added this in. Now I know we've got an error saying that we've not handled like the errors that are thrown from this decode, but we actually have another problem here that is not being, catched by the compiler. So what we've said here is we actually want our decoder to specifically be tied to the user response. So what's actually going to happen here is that if we actually pass in a file that doesn't match this model here, it's actually always going to fail. So we can't actually have a function here where we can just basically pass in any kind of file and map it to any type. And what we don't want to do is create a decode function for every single type of model that exists within our application. So how can we solve this? Well, what we're actually able to do is actually use a generic from what we learned in our previous video and actually apply a generic constraint onto this function. So what we want to do is actually apply a generic constraint of decodable onto this function and actually tell the function that we want to add in a parameter where you can actually pass in the type to tell it how you want to map it to the model that you desire. And then we also want it to, return that model back to us. So let's do that now. So we'll do this one together. So at the start of our function here, what we want to do is actually say here that we want this to be t, and then we also want after this to be decodable. So now that we've added in the constraint t and decodable, what we need to do now is we actually need to use the t within the function signature, because that's what we want to say, that I want you to basically map this placeholder where it conforms to decodable to our JSON decoder. So after this file, we're going to say here type, and then we're going to specify t dot type. So now we're able to pass in any type that conforms to decodable, and now we'll handle that within our function. So rather than just having explicitly here the user's response, instead we want to change this to be our generic t here, like so. And then, like I said before, we also want this to return the model that we've told it that we want it to map to. So here we're going to return t. Awesome. So before we carry on to the next bit, because now we have another errors, it's worth noting that later on in this course I actually will talk about this again, because starting with Swift 5.7 we can actually use some new keywords to actually help us easily declare this syntax. So we can actually reduce this syntax by using some new keywords. So we'll talk about that towards the end of this course, so make sure you subscribe and stick around. Now the next error that we have here is that it's actually saying that we need to return, and also it's saying that we're not handling any errors that are thrown. So what we want to do is we actually don't want to return anything if this fails. Instead, we actually want to technically throw an error, because there's no point of us actually returning an empty decodable object. So what we want to do is actually add in the throws keyword, like so. And what that should do is actually remove our error from our try. But now we still have our error here because it's saying that we need to return a value. Now rather than return a value, instead what we actually want to do is actually throw some kind of error to tell you that something has gone wrong during the decoding process. So now what we're going to do is actually create a new error on our static JSON mapper to actually throw, where it tells us that it actually failed to get the content. So we're going to create an extension on static JSON mapper, And then within this extension, we're going to create a mapping error. And then within this mapping error, we're also going to create a case. Cool. So this mapping error, failed to get content, is basically what we're going to throw if this fails when it actually tries to get the file and get the contents of it. So rather than return, let's just throw this error. Cool. And now you should see that this actually goes away. So now we have a brand new error, and the reason why we have this brand new error is because we're not actually returning anything if this is successful. So rather than holding this value result, instead what we're going to do is just return this line here. So let's remove this and let's just say return. Okay, cool. So now we have our JSON mapper, and we also have our function that we can use to decode any JSON file to a type that we pass in via the function parameter. So let's actually just see this in action. So to see this in action, we're going to literally just use this function when our content view appears. So let's go into our content view, and then on the text here, we're just going to add an onAppear. And then within this onAppear code, what I'm just going to do is just print out a message first, so we can just differentiate between the two different JSON files. So this one's going to be called user's response. And then just so we can easily separate and distinguish this, I'm just going to add in an emoji. Cool. And then after this line, what we're going to do is just simply just dump out the what we're going to do is actually just dump out the result that we get back from our static JSON mapper when we try to dump out the user static data file. So let's just type out the dump function, and within here we're just going to say static JSON mapper dot decode, and then the file name here is going to match the same JSON file name that we have here. So we just want to spell it the exact same. So we're going to say users static data. Now it's worth noting that we don't need to say .json because we only need to specify the file name, and that's it. Now the type here is actually going to be our user's response. Cool. So now you'll see that you actually have an error here saying that you're not handling any errors that are thrown. So we actually could use the try like so, but that means that we'd have to do the do catch, and we actually don't probably want to force unwrap it because it's possible that you may misspell this file and cause your app to crash. So instead, what we're going to do is actually just make this optional like so. Cool. Alright, cool. So now let's actually just run this because you actually can't see this being printed to the console within the SwiftUI preview. You need to actually run it on a simulator. So let's just run this on a simulator to see this in action. And now if we go into our console, you'll now see that our JSON file is actually being, mapped to our model, and our model is being dumped, and you can see all the information here within our user's response. So right now, when we call this function, it gives us back a user's response object that we can use within our application. And just to show you what would happen if we was to just misspell something, so I'm just going to put an X in here just to misspell this file name. So let's just run that again. You should see that our response is nil because it can't find that file, and it will now throw that error, so it's nil. So now let's do the same thing, but this time we'll do it for our single user data. So I'm just going to copy this, and I'm just going to paste it below. And then rather than users, we're going to say single user response. And then rather than user static data, we're just going to say single user data. Cool. And then we need to change the type here to match our user detail response. Cool, because that is the model that is being used for this file. So let's actually just run this and see what happens. And if you just go back now, you can see in our single user response, it's now successfully mapping it to our JSON file. So now we have a file well, we have a mapper now that we can easily use to just quickly simulate as if we're just calling an API request, and it's all working nicely and cleanly as well. And we can easily build on top of this in the future by just simply adding a JSON file and adding a model, and that's it. So that's everything in this video. If you enjoyed it, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up, as well as subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you on a bit. Deuces.